You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your empathic host, Abraham.
And I'm your Feels For You host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people and animals do and the policies that people put in place. And sometimes we talk about our emotions or our ability to sense emotions, which is what we're doing today.
Yeah, and I feel like empathy is a long lost art on some levels. And then also there are people who have weaponized it. And then also I feel like there are people that say they feel it really, really, really strongly. But, you know, we're going to unpack kind of all of that stuff because at the end of the day, we are really just going to start answering the question of what even is empathy, you know?
This actually started as a much smaller, more, I guess, specifically oriented topic about an aspect of empathy. And it just felt like, as in putting together the notes for this, that like we had to talk about what empathy is first. And that was a much larger discussion. And so because there's so much to unpack in this concept, to talk through it philosophically, to try and get the definition locked down, to give examples and non-examples and implications and talk about the development of this in humans and how it's relevant to culture. Like there's just so much to do. And so this is definitely going to span at the very least 2 parts. We don't know how far we'll go, possibly 3 or more, but at least 2, because there's already enough content for more than one in what we've got. But we'll just keep building on this to continue to expand that discussion. I don't think this is going to turn into anything like our series on addiction that we did earlier this year. Yeah. But it'll be at least a couple of parts.
I think it'll be fascinating. I think it's one of those things, I think that we hear the term a lot, but maybe we don't really have a good idea of what it actually is.
Yeah, I think, to say the least, as we get into the definition, we don't know exactly what it is, how it develops, what it means, all of that. And that's okay. You know, I think it'll be useful to have the discussion. And at some point, we will arrive at something closer to a consensus. Maybe not on this podcast, but someday researchers might, or we might accept that sometimes we use very nebulous terms because it is practically useful to do so.
Right.
Nevertheless, if you are joining us for the very first time, this is like the first time you've ever tuned into this podcast. First, welcome. So happy to have you here. Mm-hmm. Glad you found your way to this podcast. And we'd like to wish you a happy Aged Care Employee Day if you live in Australia.
Yeah, everywhere else, it's just a day. Actually, it's not just a day. It's Mom's Equal Pay Day everywhere else.
Very nice. It is National Beach Party Day.
Ah, love that. Being in a beach town myself. It's also National Lighthouse Day. We've got a pretty cool lighthouse here. I've been to the top of it. It's scary.
Ooh, that goes hand in hand with Beach Day, too.
Yeah, it does. I love it.
It is National Psychiatric Technician Appreciation Day. Appreciate those psychiatric technicians.
Yeah, most definitely. That's more power to y'all. It's National Raspberries and Cream Day. Ooh.
It is National Opportunity Day. So take an opportunity to go get raspberries and cream.
I love that. It's National Sea Serpent Day. I read a thing recently that historians think that sailors used to think that sea serpents existed because whales were slapping their dicks against boats. And they thought that was like the tentacle of the sea serpent, which brings me like a level of joy that you just don't understand.
I hope that that's true, and makes me think that we now need to revisit our orca episode. Maybe take a slightly different angle.
Yeah, that was a whole new fad we didn't cover.
Yeah, right. Moving on, it is a particularly preposterous packaging day. Many of us receive these things in the mail, and we're like, "Wow, why did you put it in that box or that weird shaped thing?" We can celebrate that now.
Yeah, it's preposterous. It's Professional Speakers Day. You and I have both done some gigs where we have been doing some professional speaking, which is fun. So it's nice to get a day finally.
This podcast is kind of a professional speaking gig, yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Also, many people's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
We should do a whole episode on public speaking. There's kind of a lot there.
Yeah.
Anyway, it is Purple Heart Day.
It certainly is. It's also Exercise with Your Child Week.
It is International Assistance Dog Week. I mean, any dog week is something to celebrate, but sure, assistance dogs, very important, for sure.
Every day is dog day, and we love that. It's International Clown Week, which is scary for some people, I would imagine.
Indeed. It is International Mathematicians Week, which is also scary for some people. There's a lot of scary stuff going on.
Yeah. What is this, October? It's National Bargain Hunting Week.
Okay, fair enough. It is National Minority Donor Awareness Week. This might be scary in Florida and Idaho.
Very specific. It is also Simplify Your Life Week, which sounds really nice.
Yeah, I like that one. I'll take that on.
Yeah.
It is Weird Contest Week. The weird contest this week is to simplify your life.
Yeah, good luck with that. It's World Breastfeeding Week.
And may as well say it's actually Breastfeeding Month. So you finally get to breastfeed your child. Hopefully they were not born in January. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's yeah. Ooh. I was a breastfed January baby, so I feel like I turned out okay. But that was before the laws, you know.
That's right.
It's Marine Week, which, you know, being in Florida is wonderful for that.
Sure. And Child Vision Awareness Month, very important.
It's Beautiful in Your Skin Month. Like you yourself in your own skin, not me in your skin, just to be clear.
Or anyone else in your skin. Don't wear other people's skin.
Yeah, good idea. Or animals' skin.
Yeah, just wear your own skin or wear maybe
wear
the
your
skin
own
of
skin. Come
cotton
on.
plants. Synthetic textiles. It is the Beautiful in Your Skin maybe a nudist month thing?
Maybe.
We did a whole episode on that. It is a Cheerleading Safety Month. That one is worth actually spending some time on at some point as well.
Yeah, we're going to talk about cheerleading in such a fun way, especially because like Daytona has the national cheerleading competition every year here.
I didn't know that. Oh.
It happens at the band shell, which was like right around the corner from the Starbucks I used to work in, and it was a nightmare to work because everybody wanted extra caramel frappuccinos.
Sure. Does Gojira play the cheerleading competition?
No, but they played the Olympics. They should play. They should play the cheerleading events.
That's actually why I mentioned it, because of the Olympics. We'll talk more about that at the end. Let's actually get to our episode here, because as much fun as it is to listen to us rattle off a bunch of holidays, rapid fire paced style into your ears, that's not what we're doing today. And actually, that's not what we do. I mean, we do a version of that every day, but that's not the point of this podcast. The point is to talk about psychology things, and the psychology thing we're talking about this time is this empathy thing that we mentioned. And as you talked about at the beginning, there is no real consensus on a definition, but we sort of get close-ish. So we could, and we may have to, spend an entire episode trying to define empathy. But the greatest consensus so far is that no one agrees exactly what this is. Much like consciousness in that way. But there are some sort of very broad strokes, imprecise colloquial definitions, even that will get used for research sometimes. But clearly delineating the parameters of empathy has proved somewhat elusive for people who want to find a way to use this term in a way that is consistent and pragmatic.
You know what's funny is I just had the thought, if anybody is listening to this and you are a comic book fan, there's a run on Green Lantern where the emotional spectrum powers different colored rings. So like, you know, the red ring is rage, the orange ring is avarice, the green ring is willpower, so on and so forth.
It's like synesthesia meets empathy.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Indigo Tribe is one of the groups that uses the power rings, and they are identified as like the weird, like strange, the ones that are on the outskirts, like nobody really understands what they do or how their powers work, and they speak their own language and nothing, and all that stuff. And their emotion is compassion and empathy.
Ooh, I'd be in the Indigo Tribe.
It's the only group that like everybody's like, what the is going on? So
fun.
Anyway, I thought that was like it's kind of a fun thing. So
no, I dig that.
So etymologically, the term empathy is not very old, stemming from the Greek em, which means in, and pathos, feeling, empathia, meaning feeling in, or empatheia.
I think it's
right?
empatheia, yeah. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Oh, Greeks. Empatheia meaning feeling in. Empathy first arrived in the German language in 1858 as Einfühlung.
There you go, yeah.
It was not coined as empathy in English until the 1900s.
Interestingly, It is much newer than I would have thought, really.
Yeah.
In 1955, Reader's Digest, that syndicated publication that is so well known and loved by many in modern times,
Of course.
defined empathy as, quote, the ability to appreciate the other feelings without yourself becoming so emotionally involved that your judgment is affected, end quote.
Broadly, the process of empathy is described as either labeling and imagining others' thoughts and emotions or adopting their feelings and thoughts as your own. And so you kind of see some descriptions along both of those.
Yeah, so it sort of oscillates between this, you feel what other people feel or you get what other people feel, and that it can be either one of those things in broad strokes, of course. Again, what that means, how it's defined, how it's measured gets trickier. Now, This is understandably a pretty complex relationship between a variety of human experiences from emotions and language, or from emotions to language. Well, they're tied together. It's a relationship between emotions and our language that enables an analysis and understanding like the contextual features of a particular situation, a history of an association between that situation and someone else's non-vocal reactions, and a clear distinction between ourselves and someone else in that situation. So that's a very jargon heavy way to sort of start to delineate where the different moving pieces are in empathy.
Right. So basically what we're saying is we have to have some experience with a relatively wide range of emotions. We recognize familiar body language in situations that are likely to evoke those emotions and get that someone else will have their own unique feelings and reaction to that situation.
Yeah, it's a much simpler way of saying what I said. in a way that makes more sense. Yeah. And that's great because that's sometimes helpful to start with very technical and then unpack it in much more easy to understand language.
Right.
Okay. So let's take an example here. Let's say we're at a gathering and we see that there's one person in this gathering who's kind of sitting off by themselves. They're not talking to anyone. We might look at them and recognize their lack of participation. So we see that they're doing something different from what others are doing, right? And understand that they might feel bored, scared. They might otherwise be distressed at the situation. And we can kind of know that because otherwise we might otherwise expect that they would be participating socially. And that would then change our interpretation of their behavior if they were doing that. So is this how they feel if they're sitting there alone? I mean, maybe. We don't actually know, though.
And they might say something to vocalize their thoughts and feelings, but even then, is that accurate? Is it possible they don't know how to describe their feelings? It is also possible they don't know how they are feeling, and it is also possible that they don't want to share their actual feelings. So they may lie to you or tell you what they think you want to hear so they can avoid maybe some further emotional distress or social reactions in that particular circumstance.
And maybe they don't know. Maybe they're just, for whatever reason, participation in that social setting isn't appealing to them in that moment. And they don't know why. They don't know what's going on that they feel like that just doesn't seem like something that they want to do. Maybe they do. I mean, they very well might, but I'm just saying that sometimes we'll ask them and they'll try and come up with an answer and maybe even post hoc rationalize sort of why they came up to that answer, but they might not necessarily know exactly in the moment why they're feeling that way. So we don't exactly know in that moment what they're feeling either. But again, thinking about all these other contextual features, because we started sort of broad strokes here. Someone's just sitting alone at a social gathering. Our analysis of how they feel is likely to change if we also observe some other features about what's going on for them. Let's say, for example, they're in a wheelchair. That might change how we think about what they're doing sitting all by themselves. Maybe if they're very, very young, a very young child sitting by themselves is maybe not bored. They might just not be able to do anything else. Or they're very, very old. Very old and very young people have a lot in common. If they appear to be starting to doze off, that might be boredom. It might just be that they're really tired. If they have headphones in, then likely they're just distracted by whatever other thing is going on. Maybe they're on a phone call. If they're smiling, then we might not think that they're bored. If they're gazing out at something beautiful, we might not think that they're bored or whatever, or distressed. If they're swaying as if they're intoxicated. The whole point here is in listing all of these is just to consider that, like, the fact that they're sitting there alone is going to be, and what we interpret from that is going to be colored by a variety of other features that we also observe about them that are going to be relevant in how we start to try and predict and guess what's going on in their situation and context, how they might be feeling relative to ourselves, relative to those around them.
Right. So at the end of the day, I mean, there's no way that you could possibly truly know how somebody's feeling, just like we'll never know how you're feeling when these ads play. Okay, so we've been talking about kind of observing somebody and trying to guess how they're feeling, despite the fact that we do not actually know what they're feeling. And so we've talked about the person who is bored of the party, or we assume they're bored of the party based on those contextual features. But when we start describing this, we use terms like projecting to describe our attribution of emotions to actions or state of somebody else. We are essentially saying that we recognize one's actions as belonging to a class of behaviors that we recognize from our own personal histories, and that we therefore predict that their behavior will continue in a manner that corresponds with the class to behaviors belonging to that emotion. That, again, is welcome back to the jargony world of why we do what we do sometimes.
Yes. So saying that same thing, much less jargonly, which is not a word, but I'm saying it because it makes sense.
Jargonly is a good word.
Yeah. When someone is screaming and swearing and red in the face, let's say in the United States, and we'll get to that point later, we see those behaviors and we might call them anger, right? And expect that that person is feeling angry. And therefore we expect that they are going to continue to do things we think of as angry, other behaviors and actions that are also in the broad spectrum of actions that we look at and say, those are angry things.
Sure.
And I also think, I was sort of thinking about this, that idea of we have this class of things that we're familiar with, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate, but it's familiar at least to each one of us individually. And this is embodied in the experience. I've certainly heard many people communicate to me that they have when they hear screaming in like very heavy metal music, and they think of this as being very angry because the class of behaviors that involve screaming are in the category for them of anger. Even though if you listen to the lyrics, if you can hear them, I think it's harder for people who aren't used to it. They might be singing about love or faith or silliness, they might be silly, or they might be singing about joy and sometimes anger. But the experience of just hearing the screaming, I think a lot of people are immediately like, wow, what are they so angry about? And I'm like, I no longer have that. And maybe I never did, but I don't have that in the category of things in that context of anger, but I think a lot of people do. And so we can sort of see why, as we apply this filter of understanding empathy, and you're sort of essentially saying, I observe these behaviors they're doing. For me, that means this. And so I'm assuming then that that's what they think as well. And that's sort of what projecting, I guess, is a way to think of what projecting is, and applying that to this example that I've had many times in my life, because I like heavy metal music, and people hearing that and thinking like, oh, they're so angry. Why do you are you angry because you listen to this angry music? I'm like, this song is about, he just got a new toy truck and he's really excited about it.
Yeah, well, it's like Panopticon is an example of that. Like, everything that he writes is about like Appalachian magic and like the beauty of the woods and mountains and nature. Like, every one of his songs is like just writing about beautiful landscapes, and everybody's like, what are you so mad about?
Nice.
So great. So basically what we're saying is labeling someone's behavior as empathetic is likely to occur when that person is labeling other people's behavior very readily and apparently accurately, as far as we can tell. So we're just basically saying, oh, that person is doing these things, they must be feeling this way or having this experience.
Yeah. And so if we observe in ourselves or someone else their labeling of others' emotions, and it seems like they have a high level of accuracy and fluency with that, they were like, you're an empathetic person because you can label those emotions. You might even sort of mirror those emotions and take them on yourself. We see like you start to do what that person's doing, and we say, you're a very empathetic person.
Right.
What they're feeling, we don't know. And they want to tell us, they will often share what they're feeling, and that's fine. That's great. And can be very useful. And just saying that, like, that's how we tend to call someone as being empathetic when we see them labeling other emotions or even acting in the similar way as someone else's emotions. Although, as we'll get to later, it's almost invariably adverse emotions, sad,
Right.
crushing, tragic emotions. It seems like it's rarely anything positive and rarely anything like just outside of that at all. Like I don't know that I saw in any of the sources that I found of someone like seeing someone else be afraid and themselves feeling fear.
Right.
Or I definitely did not see anyone talking about seeing someone who's demonstrating joy and them feeling joy.
Right.
It seems like it's the sort of the empaths of the world we'll get to later tends to be largely focused on the sort of aversives. Anyway.
Right.
Let's dig in more on this whole thing about our reading body language to interpret emotions.
Yes. So facial expressions, aren't they always fun? So many Psych 101 textbooks share hopeful messages of unity in human biology by pointing to evidence that our emotional reactions are similar across cultures, with the smile being a particularly favored emotional display, right? So you see people smiling and you go, oh, that's a good thing. We all smile.
Yeah, pretty much every Psych 101 textbook I've ever seen points to the smile and says a smile means the same thing everywhere in the world. We'll get to that. Now, crying and disgust, those are pretty universal. Pretty much anytime you see humans, and actually in many instances, many non-humans do those things, we're fairly clear on what the context is for that organism. It may not be as attractive to discuss in terms of the universality as it relates to humans, mostly because crying and disgust are seen as very reactionary and almost like at the point of being involuntary, right? Like we just kind of do it. But a smile is this more sort of deliberate emotional response. And what luck that we all do it and that we all do it the same too, except when we don't.
Yeah. So a famous example of this is that while in Western or American culture, a smile is seen as friendly, kind, and viewed as more attractive, trustworthy, and happy. But in Japanese culture, stoicism is more valued, and smile is often associated with pain and shame. And so we cannot necessarily assume that we are accurate when reading other people's body language, especially if we're coming from a very specific cultural lens when we're interpreting these.
Yeah. And observing body language from someone who grew up in a completely different culture, we might make some assumptions that are not accurate based on our own history. And it makes sense. Like we use heuristics because they're efficient. And so if we are familiar with and have seen and are usually accurate when observing some body language and we see it in someone else, even if they're from a different culture, we might assume something about what that person's feeling and just not be accurate. And that's okay. Like that is what it is, right? Like we don't know what we don't know sometimes,
right?
All the time, actually, because that's what not knowing means.
That's what not knowing is. Yeah. Once we know, we do not know anymore.
We might know that we don't know. And so it's like one step closer to knowing. Anyway, point being that like that is just a feature of that we do. I think it's useful to understand that sometimes we're wrong. I think that's the biggest takeaway.
Yeah.
Now, nevertheless, there has been a clear effort to understand empathy, this ability to sort of read and interpret emotions as scientifically as possible by classifying and categorizing as objective a measure as possible of an emotion. Like when we look at emotion, what's the most objective way that we could then categorize that emotion? What can we look at that's concrete and we can apply this filter to say that's that emotion? And then we evaluate then responses to that emotion in terms of whether people label it in a way that is consistent. So basically saying this body language, this facial expression is an emotion, and people who can correctly label that can correctly identify that emotion.
Sure. So Paul Ekman, and we've talked about Ekman on here before, found a significant amount of consistency in how raters judged images of emotional expression and developed what's called a facial action coding system, or FACS, not FAC from the bear.
That's right.
Which would be more fun and joyful. But the facial action coding system, or FACS, FACS.
Nothing but the facts.
When I was in elementary school, I was in a Christmas play and like a Christmas musical, and we had to do a rap called about faxing our Christmas list to Santa Claus, and it was a fax of facts is what we were supposed to do in that song. And I'll never forget how embarrassing that was.
That is an interesting premise.
Yeah, it was the 90s, you know?
Yeah. You know what's enduring technology, we should definitely make a musical about? Fax machines.
Fax machines. Yep.
They're really, really good. Even in the 90s, they were like on their way out the door.
I know.
Okay. From this system, this facial action coding system, or FACS, participants are shown images of people's faces in which the person in the image is supposed to be conveying a relatively unambiguous, specific emotion. So basically, it's just a picture of their face. It's got some emotion. It's supposed to be clear what that emotion is. The viewer of said image, the person who's looking at the picture, then labels the emotion they believe as being portrayed by the person in the picture. And then their answer is dichotomously scored as either correct, meaning it matches the label assigned to that picture, or as incorrect, meaning it does not match the label assigned to that picture.
Right. So it's just tatting. It's a match to sample program. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah. It's just say what this emotion is. There's like 8 possible correct answers. If it's not one of those 8, then you're wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there have been many useful and pragmatic applications of Ekman's research with facial expression as expressive analysis, but we aren't going to go into them here just yet, although we should in the future, right, Mike?
Yes. Mike, one of our patron supporters who has talked about his experience with the facial coding system. So I'd really like to talk more about that. So we'll get back in touch. We started making some movement on that a long time ago. Anyway, so this is Ekman's thing, the system here and all of that. But we do need to sort of continue to wear our skeptical hats and our scientific hats here. Again, this is not to be overly critical of Ekman's facial system. I think there has been some interesting stuff that's come out of that that's worth following up on. But in terms of understanding exactly how empathy works, we are going to continue to sort of demystify it, I guess, unpack it. I don't know. We're going to talk about it some more in an important way that hopefully elucidates the caveats to such approaches, because there's a few issues with just the system of if you can label a picture, then you have empathy, right? Let's start with that. And I don't think that was Ekman's premise,
right?
But people have attempted to use his system in that way. So let's start with the fact that if the somewhat obvious issue of that you're just labeling a picture, that grading someone's label of a facial expression as being correct or incorrect based on a series of pictures. And I said before there was 8 possible answers. What I meant is like there's 8 possible emotions. There's only one correct answer for each picture. Just make sure that's clear.
Sure.
All right. Now, the thing is, like, again, you're basically looking at a picture and you say what the emotion is that you observe in that picture. And then you're basically told whether your observation is correct or incorrect. But that, I think, has some implications to it. There are several emotions that have similar facial arrangements. That's one. And so we might look at a particular image that has a lot of similar features. Let's say sadness, disgust, and anger might have a lot of overlap, and like a downturned mouth, right?
Sure.
And kind of furrowed eyebrows could all be part of that similarly. And like there are features of them that are kind of unique, but there are some overlap. And so what part that someone pulls out as being the most important to them as they interpret it is just what's ever important to them. Like that's the history they're bringing to their observation of that picture.
Right.
And everyone is going to bring their own history every single time they observe anybody making any particular facial expression, which means you are just as correct as anyone else, except when you know that person better, which we'll talk about probably the next episode. But
right.
Anyway, that's one issue. Also, it's not particularly representative of how emotions may be displayed in an actual dynamic, ongoing scenario in which facial expressions might change rapidly in an evolving context. Rarely do we hold an expression on our face for a long period of time so someone can gaze at it and then while they're gazing at it, eventually arrive at a label for that emotion. Most of the time when we're engaging with people, their emotions are flying through a spectrum of variety and what they're showing on a pretty rapid pace, right? So that's another issue. And then finally, the way this was put together, and for a Western audience, this makes perfect sense, but the images use Western faces exhibiting Western expressions of the emotions that we have labeled and categorized as important and belonging to those set of expressions. This means that might not be very applicable to other cultures, as we talked about already with the example of smiling. And Ekman himself noted that in some applications, 50% of people in different cultures specifically labeled the sad emotion picture as angry instead. And they did so very consistently.
Right.
So that facial expression might be better represented as anger in that culture, or maybe anger and sadness just look more similar to one another in that culture. Then that's totally okay.
Right. So whether you're labeling a face as sad or angry or feeling those emotions, we're going to play ads regardless. And you may feel all of those things really rapidly.
The one thing you probably did not feel was joy, and I understand.
So in addition to what Abraham had mentioned earlier, the context of the situation and our familiarity with the people can be critically important. More information that we have about a situation, the more likely we're going to make a better guess or better kind of description of whatever that is. So the Kuleshov effect in cinema is an effect demonstrated by Russian filmmaker Lev Kuleshov in the 1910s and 20s, in which the film portrays a shot of an actor with a somewhat ambiguous or even neutral expression, and then a shot of something happening in context, and then the actor's face again unchanged, in which the interspersed shot of the context alters the audience's interpretation of the expression of the actor. And this is super, super fascinating. We may even do an entire episode on it, and it may not even be real. So that's also a fun thing to think about too.
Does that all make sense to follow that? Like the idea is basically what is cut between the shots of someone's face affects how you interpret that person's expression.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool.
Basically, you might have an interpretation when you see that person's face, then there's a context shot, and then when you go back to that face, it changes how you've interpreted that initial shot.
Exactly. Yeah. That is something that was talked about in. I think there have been multiple papers that have looked at this and have been talked about in which they sort of say that you can establish an interpretation of those things and how a film is edited. So as an example of that, let's imagine a person on screen that has sort of an unclear facial emotion, let's say even expressionless, right? Mm-hmm. Then the camera cuts to an image of a terrifying monster starting to make its way toward the camera. So we see a person's face, then we see a monster approaching the camera. Then it cuts back to that first person again who has the same expression on their face. The audience could potentially interpret that actor as displaying a subtle yet powerful example of being frozen in fear, when really the editor did all the work here.
Right.
But that's the whole idea of this Kuleshov effect, is the idea that the context matters in how we interpret the depiction of what's going on in the screen in the sequence in which things are sort of edited together or observed together.
Right. So this applies to our interpretation of other people's emotions, for which we not only look at their facial expression and body language, but we also do so with an understanding of their situation or the context in which they're in that they're displaying that emotion. So it's not just facial expressions and body language alone. It is so much more than that.
Yeah, it paints a really comprehensive picture of what's going on. Researchers have attempted a more robust analysis of empathy by trying to, so the reason that we're talking about all of this is just trying to get a handle on how we even interpret emotions. What tools are we using? Because we do use body language and facial expression. We do use context. We do use our history of learning. And if we look at those pictures, there's this criticism that our ability to label those pictures is not a very representative of what our skill is, because we don't have this dynamic ongoing interaction. We're not watching a video. And so researchers sort of got together and thought, okay, how could we do this in a way that more accurately represents what happens in real social scenarios? And so they did this more robust analysis where they did the empathic accuracy paradigm is sort of the research setup here. And they sort of thought, and this makes perfect sense to me, let's have two people actually talk to one another and then report on their interpretation of someone else's thoughts and feelings. Rather than those still images, they put two random participants together and they speak to one another. This is a recorded conversation, and so later the participants watch that recording and they're asked to interpret the emotions and thoughts of their conversational partner at various points of the recording. So they might pause it and say, okay, what were they thinking there? And you can see the advantage here that we have someone who is that they actually have an ongoing evolution of emotions showing up. You would get to have the history that's brought to it. You get context. You're directly observing it. You get to see it change over time. You'd think then this would be a much more robust way of getting a clear analysis of, or like a clearer label of someone else's emotions.
Right. So in this arrangement, the accuracy is scored by matching the participant's interpretation of their partner against their partner's own description of their thoughts and feelings in that situation. And accuracy is achieved when the participant states a similar interpretation of their partner's emotion as their partner says about their own emotion. So basically, accuracy just says, like, as we're interpreting this, we go, oh, one person labeled the emotion. Did they get the emotion right as described by the person actually experiencing the emotion?
Exactly. All right. Now, Shane, don't look ahead.
Okay.
We're gonna do a test. Shane is looking at the ceiling. I can confirm. How accurate would this need to be? Like, let's give it a percentage. How accurate would this need to be to feel like we've got a good handle on how well people can label each other's emotions?
I would say 80% or above, right? Like, I feel like 80% or above would be I feel like that would be consistent enough to be useful.
Okay.
I would say 80% or above.
Okay, keep looking up.
Okay.
What if it was 50% accurate? Would that be enough to say that was a pretty good rate of understanding of someone's emotion?
No. No.
Okay.
That's a coin flip.
Yeah, oh sure. I mean, it's not quite a 50-50, like there's more than two emotions, but yeah, you're right. Like 50% is generally like you could get it wrong, you could get it right. All right, yeah, so probably not. Well, that's good then, because what their accuracy actually was about 22%. You can stop looking up now.
Oh, okay, I can stop looking up now. Okay. So It wasn't accurate at all.
No, it was far below any like reasonable threshold of how much we would predict that someone would be able to guess about someone's emotion when they're right there talking to that person experiencing their emotion firsthand. They were about 22% accurate.
Wow. That's not good. All right, so does this mean that we're bad at empathy, I guess? Maybe as a question that I would have, I would say like, I don't know where they're right there. Or that maybe this measure of empathy is a component of empathy, but not sufficient to capture it. Or is it completely wrong? Interestingly, the accuracy improves dramatically if the two people talking are friends. So like if the two people in the context actually know each other. So if they have a history of familiarity with the person, their accuracy does increase all the way to 50%, implying that in part, our ability to interpret other people's emotional states is at the very least aided by personal history with that person. So we're not generally pretty accurate. We tend to be more accurate if we know the person.
Yeah, like some people very accurate labeling the pictures, very inaccurate at labeling in an actual situation when they're talking to someone. I mean, those pictures are static, they don't move, and they're meant to be pretty emblematic of the emotions that are portrayed in those pictures. Like those are sort of the archetypes, if you will. And then in these dynamic conversations, you should have the advantage of like ongoing history and participation with that person, so you even get context, and it's still pretty bad. And then you get to like, I actually know this person well. We have history together. I know how they talk. I know how they communicate. And then we get all the way up to really bad still, but better, but still really bad at it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny to think like, you know, that you might be really in tune with like your partner or like your best friend. Like you may pay attention to subtleties a little bit more. And even then our studies show like, we're about 50%.
I didn't look to see how this shook out with like married couples or people who had been in like an actual romantic relationship for a long period of time. I would guess that it would be higher most of the time.
Yeah, I would agree.
So anyway, all this means that our emotional expressions and our ability to label emotional expressions in others is calibrated across a wide range of complex factors that starts all the way at the level of our genetic makeup, our language and our culture, our learning history, the context of the interaction, and our interpersonal history with those around us. And that is a lot of layers to try and distill down into one single test, such as just facial expressions or even a single conversation.
Right. So all of this, and to say really nothing of what emotions even are or how they work or what the pragmatic utility and importance of empathy in terms of how it affects subsequent actions that people may take. We like, you know, at this point in time, we're like, can we even measure this? Can we like, what does this look like? What are we doing? And we just kind of land on, I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, like, Empathy is an expansion on the idea of emotions, generally speaking. And I don't think that we have super thoroughly tackled emotions in the past. And so, like, we're sort of making some assumptions that that is well understood enough for us to have a conversation about empathy, and we'll probably need to take that on at some point. But then again, like, there's this really pragmatic aspect of this that is really important, which is just because let's say you could correctly label those pictures, you could correctly label things in a conversation, you're really good at it when you know the person. What does that mean in terms of your overall behavior? What are you likely to do if you're really good at those sorts of things?
Right.
Does it matter? Like, what if you feel nothing about what other people feel, but you choose to do good things and help other people anyway?
Right.
Again, does it matter? Does it matter how you feel? Maybe. I don't know. We'll unpack some more of that as this conversation continues to evolve. So we'll probably pause this conversation for now. We'll pick it up next time with part 2, where we'll talk about like emotion as it develops in young children. We'll talk about some implications of empathy and to the extent to which it matters and whatnot. But yeah, I think I wanted to end this on the discussion and sort of the cliffhanger thought experiment-y conversation start. I don't know. The idea here that even if we understand this, does it matter? Why does it matter? How does it matter? And I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm not asking that question because I think the answer is no. I'm asking because I think we actually want to consider the implications here. We want to try and work through critically what aspects of this are important, why and how. Maybe a lot of them, maybe none of them, maybe most of them. I don't know. We'll figure it. We'll try and figure it out. We're not going to probably solve it in these 2 episodes, but we'll at least, I think, we'll unpack some features of this that we think are important enough to have landed on a position where we say, this is probably about the right way we think we need to be going on this. At least my hope is that. And I mean, mostly because I think that conversation has already happened. I think most people have already landed on why and how and the extent to which this is important and what parts are more or less important than others. But we'll definitely spend some more time on that next time in subsequent conversations. But
yeah,
anything else you have to add on this part, Shane?
I think you did a really good job at the end there, kind of like saying that, we want to unpack this to understand this more. But I think it is important to understand that, like, part of the reason that we're studying or like having conversations about emotions in general, or why we're doing research about emotions and want to understand them, is because it is such an integral part of the human experience in general, right? Like, we experience these, and giving names to things gives us some power in understanding like how we can go about using those things, or like giving us a better understanding of the universe around us, right? And so emotions are something that every human experiences, or at least for the most part, right, experiences a wider range and variety of them. So I think it's just fascinating stuff to study more than anything.
Yeah, and as it relates to our ability to interpret one another's emotions, this empathy piece feeds into the fact that we are such a social species. We've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast, that if you look around you, you're probably surrounded by the outcome of a cooperative society where people work together and are not lone wolves.
Right.
Where, we drive on our side of the road, following certain rules, obeying some traffic laws,
right?
But we also are able to build buildings, and we exchange money for food, and like, it's not this all-out chaotic sort of dog-eat-dog world. The reason we're this as successful as we are as a species is because we cooperate,
right?
And part of our cooperation seems to be entailed in our ability to understand other people's sort of emotional states, and that's this sort of empathy piece. So that's, I think, digging into a little bit of next time. But I do want to leave, most of the time when we do a 2-parter, fewer people listen to the second part than the first part. And for those of you who are interested, part of where this started had to do with hyper empathy or extreme empaths. And so that will be part of the conversation next time, is digging into that. So if that was something you were specifically looking for, that's where this is intended to go in the second part. And I think it offers it offers a unique twist on the current conversation of empathy that we've been having.
Right. Absolutely. I'm looking forward to getting into this more too, because I feel like, living in a beach town, I feel like there's a lot of people that call themselves empaths, and so I want to understand them a little bit more.
Really? I would have not thought that.
Bunch of hippie granola. I'm just kidding. If you identify somebody who's like an extreme empath, like it is something I hear a lot because there's a lot of like folks here that have like a very they identify as very spiritual, and that is something that comes up a lot in that world. A lot is like extreme empathy and spirituality and some of that, like at least in my conversations with folks. So I'm interested to get into like this a little bit more. Yeah.
That is not something I would have mostly expected in Florida, but that's okay. Sure.
That's yeah. I mean, empathy in Florida on short supply, but I think in general, like a lot of this, like the spirituality part, I think comes up a lot. In like in the smaller beach town areas, because where it's a little bit more hippie and like small towny.
Yeah, you'll find it in sort of pockets of here.
I live near Casadega. Casadega is like historically a witch town, so like there is like is like magic and esoteric thinking here too a little bit, Got
you. Yeah, Florida, I think generally I would view, I understand as a state trying to legislate empathy out of existence.
They've been working on it.
Yeah. Anywhere you go, you're going to find pockets of people in sort of just a different countercultural orientation to where it is they're living.
Right.
Municipality.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what we have to say about Florida. If you would like to talk to us about, I mostly throw Florida under the bus because I've lived there and you currently live there. But there's many states and governments and politicians that I think should really be in the crosshairs in equal measure. Greg Abbott, I think, is the opposite of an extreme empath.
Yeah.
If someone feels a heightened emotion that reflects other people's emotions, his is just a heightened vitriol for all living things. So.
Yep.
Anyway, if you would like to talk to us about what we've said so far on emotions, or even talk to us about what you would like to hear us say about emotions, you can certainly email us at info@wwd.podcast.com. I won't promise we will get those emails before we've had a chance to have a conversation about it, but we would love to hear from you anyway. And if you send us a nice, good, juicy one, we might even just read it in an episode for other people to hear. But we like hearing from you no matter what. So you can reach us directly. You can also reach us on social media. And if you like what you heard today and you would like to support us, you can do so financially by picking up some merch or heading over to Patreon, where you can join the club. Join the club of really cool people. And over there, you get access to all kinds of bonus content and extra goodies and behind the scenes stuff. And you also help us continue to make this podcast. It means we can pay Justin to make it sound like a podcast. Mm-hmm. We can pay for a domain to host the podcast. And it's stuff that we like to do. So if you like to help, you can do it that way. But as I said, you can also just do a one-time thing and pick up some merch. And if you don't want to do so financially, then there's other ways to do that, which before I do that, I need to thank the people who have already joined us on Patreon. That's Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle. Thank you, patrons.
Yeah, y'all are so wonderful. We love you.
And if you're not already a patron hearing this, I'll read your name too if you join us over there. But what I was going to say is other ways you can support us that are not necessarily financial, but do help us out. Leave us a rating. If you're feeling particularly ambitious, you can leave us a review. When you do that rating, if you go all the way up to 5 stars, you'll feel the warm fuzzies. Everyone else will feel the warm fuzzies. It'll help us show up in other people's feeds. If you subscribe, that'll help make sure that we always show up in your feed. You might not necessarily choose to listen to every episode. You see one come up and you're like, I don't really care about that. You can just mark it as played or whatever, it'll go away, or just listen to it really quick, and then we get that listen download to show up on our algorithm, and yay for us. Anyway, you can support us lots of ways. Go out and tell a friend. Go out and put a sticker on something you have. We have Why We Do What We Do stickers. They're out there. I think that's it. Anything else that I forgot or that you'd like to add? There is something I forgot. I'm not even going to give you a chance to tell me because I know what it is, which is that the other thing that makes this podcast happen is my wonderful team of people, writing and fact checking from Shane, and I help with that too. And then our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and the guy in the chair who does the sound making gooding thing is Justin, who is massively necessary to making us sound like two people who are actually having a conversation and not two people who are talking away from one another in different parts of the country, which is how it might otherwise sound.
In entirely different time zones.
Entirely different time zones. Yeah. So thank you very much to our team of people. Now, before we close out, this is I know I've been reading the credits and maybe you've been skipping through going, whatever, I don't care. And hopefully you will even hear this part because we're not done. After we do the credits here, we'd like to talk about something that we are recommending. This is just a thing that we like to do is share some of our joys. Maybe you'll share those joys too, maybe not, but here are some recommendations.
Recommendations.
So my recommendation is just the absurdity of the world and the timeline that we live in right now and how great it is.
Cool. I like it so far.
Yeah. At the time of this recording, the Paris Olympics are going on. They recently had the opening ceremonies 2 days ago, and that's always a spectacle. Well, this year they really have caused quite a ruckus because one, everybody thinks they did like a drag version of the Last Supper. That's not what happened at all. So it's all about like the Greek god Dionysus and all that. So
that's a good idea though.
Yeah, it'd probably be a blast, but people would be so upset.
Please do a drag version of the Last Supper, somebody. But also I get, that it was the Dionysus thing, and that's cool. Good with that.
The reason I am thinking about the Olympics right now is because a metal band called Gojira played and performed in the opening ceremonies. Now, normally, I'm just not going to be like, oh yeah, a band that is like a kind of like an underground or like an alternative like rock, type of band. I would not say anything about that, but their performance was particularly awesome because they played. Have you seen the video at all?
No, I did not actually even know about this until you mentioned it,
dude. So they played a song that was about the beheading of Marie Antoinette on a building called the Conciergerie. The Conciergerie is the former prison and residence of French kings during the French Revolution.
Wow.
So they built platforms for each of the band members to play on the side of this giant prison. And each of them have their own platform and they're playing this really heavy song. And underneath them, they're just shooting fire. There's so much fire. It's just so cool. And at the end of the song, they fire like blood red streamers out of every window from the prison.
Wow.
Like it is so absurd. And it's so great that happened on a global platform. That was the first time.
Yeah.
Like had to have been like people just being like, what is this? They're a band that I don't really follow or listen to, but I just thought it was like very cool to be like, this is a thing that happened at the Olympics. So anyway, that's my recommendation is just go to watch their performance because it's pretty rad. Like it's so cool to watch.
I'm surprised they didn't put some like guillotines on stage with them or something.
Somebody was probably like, okay, there's a line here.
That's fair. All right. So this is a video. You're recommending a video of Gojira performing at the Olympics. I'm definitely checking this out. As it were.
Yeah, it's so much cooler than I just described. It looks so ridiculous.
Now, this sounds like this is a recommendation for Shane to recommend things to me, but this is for everybody. Yeah. And my recommendation is also for everybody. And actually, I'm sort of recommending a Shane recommendation from a while back, which has happened before, which is the TV show The Bear, specifically season 3, because at the time of this recording, season 3 has been out for just a little while, a few weeks maybe, or maybe it's been longer. I don't know. Time is weird. But anyway, I will say, if you've been watching The Bear, this is probably not the strongest season they've ever had in terms of plot. I would say there was a lot of cool visuals and a little of advancement of the story. But I'll also say that like the worst season of The Bear is still like one of the best seasons of television ever. So
right.
It's still really good. It's still like lots of great things happen in it. And so it just wasn't my favorite, but I think many people it was their favorite. I think it was a good season. So like if you're interested in The Bear and you haven't seen season 3 yet, I do recommend it. And maybe it'll even be your favorite. I would say it's very cinematically interesting. I think they just did not a lot of the plot evolved very quickly, and that's okay. I think they're planning. I think they're setting up some things for subsequent seasons to really take place. But nevertheless, still really good. As I said, you could hardly go wrong with that TV show. So season 3 of The Bear,
pretty incredible. Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's like 3, maybe 4 plot points.
Yeah,
that like are very quick and very They don't progress until like the last 2 episodes, but it's like it's so good.
Yes, yeah. A lot of build up to those major developments, and then a lot of visual stuff. That's cool. This is streaming, I think, exclusively on Hulu. I think this is a Hulu original thing, something like that.
Yes.
So that's where you will find it. But okay, I think that is all that I have to say about Gojira or TV shows. And for right now, that is what we have to say about Empathy. But we'll be back with part 2 next week. But is there anything that I forgot or anything you'd like to add before we close it out, Shane?
Nope, that's all I got.
All right. Thank you all so much for listening. We will see you next week. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.